Hello and welcome. My name is Adam Koplan. I am the Artistic Director of the Flying Carpet Theater, and we are hosting a family history and genealogy podcast and discussion series. We have been doing it for a couple of weeks. It's an offshoot of a long-running exploration of the theater company into people's stories, what makes people tick. We have a solo show series, and we found across many years of doing solo shows that people's families, and indeed their ancestral histories, often play a big role in how they see themselves. So this discussion series is a deeper and continued exploration into that idea. How does our deep ancestry and or our family stories help us understand ourselves? Our co-host is Pete Candler, who I've known for many years, high school classmate, and he runs a incredibly deep and beautiful website with writing and photography called The Deeper South. Our guest today, and I'm very excited for this conversation, is Joel Johnson. Joel and I went to college together, and in fact, the most of the plays that we did in college were kind of canonical plays, or we didn't do much new work. Most of my career has been in new work, and Joel wrote one of the few plays that got a big production while at college, and I happened to act in it. So this is kind of a great sort of full circle. Joel probably won't talk much about this right now. He runs his own marketing company called Admirable Devil, and he's had over the years many important positions in the marketing field, but early in his life and career, he was a great playwright, so I wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
So welcome, Joel, and with that, I think we will kick off. Pete, any words before we dive in?
No, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while myself, so I'm really eager to jump in.
Perfect. Well, we'll start the way we have been starting the last couple of times, which is getting right into the stories. Joel, can you think of an ancestor, somebody in your family who you find especially interesting, and you can tell us a little bit about them and how you came to find this out?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much, Pete. Thank you so much, Adam, for having me on this show. I really appreciate it. And, most of the time, as you well know, family stories are pretty boring. You go to cookouts and the family historian starts talking and everyone's eyes glaze over. That's kind of how it is when I talk about my family history to my family. So anytime I can, chat about the people that I've discovered and their lives and share that, and especially record it in this way, is amazing. So thank you. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation too. I've got lots of fun stories to share, interesting stories about my ancestors, and I think that they will, people will find some reflection and commonalities in their own lives. Just to jump right in, I think, I started looking at my family history like many people, looking for great people, great people with great stories. And particularly as an African-American, I have been inspired and kind of stimulated by the last 20 or so years of genealogical research, that began with Haley and then has extended on to Dr. Gates' shows and many other popular TV shows. But I've been doing my family history for 20 years. And when I started looking, I was like, I want to find something great. I want to find an interesting story. I want to find an ancestor who, invented something, or was a senator, or was special. And I think at the time I started, one of the immediate places I looked at, which was, I think, a little stereotypical, was the Civil War. I wanted to know if I had any ancestors who fought in the Civil War, who were, played any key roles in the Civil War, you know, and obviously that is just a big leap to just sort of say, I'd like to know more, you know, about ancestors in the Civil War. And I asked my family, you know, did we have anybody who fought in the Civil War? I asked my mother, I asked my father. My father's side, he really didn't know anybody and couldn't say anything. My mother shared a story. She had heard from her mother and her grandmother that one of her ancestors was directly related to Robert E. Lee. And this was something that was, I had heard, I think, growing up briefly. It was kind of like one of those family things that just been around. But I was like, is there any truth to that? You know, that was my sort of hypothesis. And, you know, it's honestly, it took like 15 years to kind of get the skills necessary to do all of the research that led to my discovery. But I was able to identify a couple of different ancestors who had a connection directly to the Civil War. One was my third grade uncle, Levi Chase. Levi Chase was a previously enslaved man on Maryland's Eastern Shore in Queen Anne County, which is honestly about a 30-minute drive from where I live now in Silver Spring, just across the bridge into the Eastern Shore. And I say he was previously enslaved because Black people on the Eastern Shore were in a really interesting situation up to the Civil War. There was a large population of free people of color there. In fact, I think it was like half of the Black population there were free. The other half were enslaved. And it was very weird. You had mixed Black families of free and enslaved families working in communities. And actually, Levi Chase was one of those. His father was free. His mother was free. He had siblings who were free. He was enslaved. And that's a whole nother story about how that happened. But the family that enslaved him was a family known as the Good Hands. And at that time, it was 1864, the war effort were looking to recruit people. They went to Maryland because Maryland had this sort of mixed sympathies between North and South. And they set up a situation where they were like, we will give you a bounty. You know, if you were literally free your enslaved labor to fight, you know, and join the Civil War, and join the army and fight in that war, we will give you a bounty. And so Good Hand actually signed up for this bounty. The original bounty was $300. In the end, she wound up getting $100 for freeing Levi Chase. Levi Chase joined the 39th Regiment, Company I, and then later went on to fight in several battles with that regiment, including just down the road from me in Petersburg, Virginia, at the Battle of the Crater, one of the most pivotal and well-known battles of the Civil War that involved the U.S. colored troops. A few years after the war, not long, Levi Chase died. He did not live a very long life, but he did have kids and family. And, you know, I think a lot of it, I think one of the reasons why he probably passed away, I think he was sick from the war. Many soldiers got ill and came back and died or died before the end of the war. Those who weren't killed in action or captured and sold back into slavery in colored troops. Anyway, Levi Chase, a remarkable man, I think, living under remarkable circumstances. So that's one story about the Civil War. This now, just to get back to this myth. Now, Levi Chase is actually on my father's line. On my mother's line, where this original question came about of, you know, are we related to Robert E. Lee? So in researching my mother's line, I came across a large line in family that were centered in Augusta County in Virginia, and particularly in the town of Staunton, or Stanton, depending on how you pronounce it. So my ancestor, I believe he's my third, maybe my fourth great-grandfather, Philander Ransom, or Philip Ransom. He was already, I believe, in his 50s when the Civil War started, and he was enslaved. And I know this because I came across a document called Marriage Cohabitation Records, and it listed his wife, and it listed his kids, and it also had a really amazing column on it that I have rarely seen in other documents, and it said enslaver or former master. And on it was listed a name. The name was Briscoe Baldwin. And for all you Civil War historian buffs out there, Briscoe Baldwin was the son of, technically Briscoe Baldwin Jr. was the son of Gerald Briscoe Baldwin Sr., who was a well-known judge in Virginia, one of the biggest political leaders in Virginia for a long time. And his son had a couple of sons. Daniel Baldwin was the other one, and Daniel Baldwin was really well known for having, basically gone to Lincoln and tried to convince him not to start the Civil War. But Briscoe Baldwin was the quartermaster for the U.S. Army of Virginia. I'm sorry, for the Southern Army of Virginia. So basically the Confederacy. And so as the quartermaster, he was in close relationship with Robert E. Lee throughout the war. Served with him, went with him everywhere, from every major battle, including Gettysburg and the surrender at Appomattox. And so Philander, I could find no initial evidence that suggested that Philander participated in the war and how, except that right after emancipation, he was involved in purchasing a lot of land, and actually a few lawsuits between the community, the Black community, recently freed Black community in Staunton, and over some church matters. He also acted as a witness in several matters in his local community. And what was clear is that not only could he read and write, he was numerate. He was basically a money lender for his community, and had some access to capital, and he actually understood how to use mortgages and leases and things like that. So he was engaged heavily in the sort of Republican Party as they really were trying to find a way through Reconstruction and sort of moving African Americans into the Republican Party at that time, because he was very much interested in the support that had come out of that party at that time against the Southern Democrats, who were really very obviously still quite racist at that point and anti-Black. So what I basically have come to realize is that Phil Ransom was Briscoe Baldwin's body slave, basically his valet. And he was very likely dragged along everywhere that Briscoe Baldwin went. And that's how he gained his literacy. That's how he gained his numeracy, and also why he was such an influential figure after the Civil War ended in his community. So, it's a connection that, to me, revealed that, some of the myths and stories that we tell in our family history have these kernels of truth in them, but we don't quite know how they manifested themselves. Later on, after I found that information, I thought back to my conversation with my mother and realized that, she had told me maybe we're related to Robert E. Lee, but we're definitely related to related or have a relationship to somebody who was a very high level ranking Confederate. And so now, the wonderful thing about the research is we figured it out. I've been able to uncover that information and understand, this connection. So there's many more stories like that I found on various lines, but those are two interesting ones because I think they speak to both my paternal and maternal line, and also show, that that there's many, there's just many discoveries waiting for you once you kind of fall into this family history obsession.
Can I ask a quick question, Joel, about Philander? Did you ever have a chance to uh, share what you discovered about him with your mother.
No, I didn't. So my mother passed away, and I was not able to pass on that information to her. And she was an only child, so no, she didn't have anybody else in her family who was particularly interested in that. And her parents had also passed away at that time. So it's unfortunate. I mean, I think that one of the things about the reasons why I do my family history work is I want this information to never be lost again. And, you know, for both my mother and my father, and their parents, what I've learned in my research is just how much sort of material fact history has been lost, you know, and it's been lost for a lot of reasons we can kind of get into, but now that I've found it again, I don't want it to ever be lost again. That's one of the reasons why I've been writing and documenting it in both my blog. I also maintain a lot of active files and regularly share those with my siblings. I have a very large family, and I want my kid, I have a 7-year-old daughter. I want her to be able to share these stories with her kids down the road.
Mm. Let's actually chat a little bit about this idea of stories being lost, because in some way, Joel, I think stories being lost was almost the impetus for me and Pete to start this in the first place. I think both of us came to it from this huge curiosity around what we were calling amnesia of a sort. And that in each of our own families, there was a kind of lack of accurate information about our ancestors that we had received. And it took some work to actually get more towards facts that allowed us to build our own truths about them. And I'm curious, you know, we can chat a little bit if you want about, you know, what those amnesias were, but let's start with you. I'm curious what your take is on why it was lost in your estimation, and, you know, what some of those factors were.
Well, I mean, I speculate that it was lost because of, for a number of reasons. The information was painful, you know, to start. I think that, so my mother was very, very light-skinned, very light-skinned. Her mother was a very, very, very light-skinned. I mean, basically could have passed for white. And she was, and my great grandmother similarly, and so forth. And so there was a issue. There was an obvious pain about that. So being African American and being light skinned, you know, there's really only one reason why you're light skinned, and that's because of the trauma of rape. And the trauma of rape has often happened in slavery. And, you know, obviously somewhat in Jim Crow, but definitely during that period of time. And, you know, what's interesting is the African-American community, we also, not only do we suffer from, you know, the historical trauma of racism, but there's also colorism. And colorism, you know, is a kind of a racism based on, you know, well, are you dark skin or black skin? You know, how much white blood do you have versus how much black blood? This was clearly a painful subject for my mother's family, and it got somewhat mythologized. And the fact that Robert E. Lee was such a prominent white figure that throughout Jim Crow, you know, since you know, the end of the Reconstruction period had been exalted by America, there was a kind of like a latching on to Lee as well. This is possibly a great ancestor, then, you know, one of those kinds of things, without really thinking about what the actual facts were and what the actual story was, and perhaps that getting muddled over time, and, you know, people not being able to share the whole story because of the pain of what the reality was. And the reality is probably very likely that Philander Ransom, you know, was the son of a, you know, a white man, you know, very much. It's probably one of the reasons. And that could easily be another reason why he was the valet of Briscoe Baldwin, and why he had access to things like literacy and numeracy, you know. So pain, yeah, I mean, pain is pain, you know, it's like we have that, you know, the reason why our bodies help us to forget pain so quickly is because we hate trauma, you know, trauma sucks. But the reality is that the trauma kind of morphs and changes. It never really goes away. It just changes and it becomes amnesia, in my opinion. And I see that story in every single line that I've researched in my family history. And I think that it's not limited to, by any means, to anyone based on race. I mean, it could happen for so many other reasons. So.
Mm. So that actually circles back to a question I had about Philander, which was when the way your mom talked about it, you used the word related, and then you kind of talked a little bit about what it meant to be the valet of somebody in Lee's circle. And was she using related in the there's a connection, or was she using related in the like we share DNA and
in
ancestry?
the familial? Yes, exactly. The latter, right? And that's right. And that's tricky, right? Because so when I first heard this story, you know, it's 20, 30 years ago, you know, there was a different time when, you know, the idea of being related to any great white man was like exciting, you know. And here we are in 2020, and obviously the legacy of Robert E. Lee is very much in the conversation and has changed dramatically in the cultural conversation in America. We've got just down the road, you know, in Richmond, where my father lives, the Lee Monument coming down, and it's surrounded not just by, you know, people of color who are angry, but also by white people who are angry because of the, you know, because of the white supremacy and the cultural embrace, you know, of people like Lee at the expense of people of color. And so, so it was interesting, you know. I think things like that pained my family, you know. It was like an acknowledgement, an understanding that there was involvement somehow, but, you know, searching for any kind of sense of greatness, you know, that's a, you know. And so one of the things that's deeply, deeply empowering about family history is that you can see the cycle of learning and struggle and pain and progress in a family relationship. That's why I have a blog about this called Struggle and Progress. And when I came across the Frederick Douglass quote, I was like, that's it. I mean, that's exactly it, right? You see this sort of cycle of struggle and progress to grapple with our personal histories and our place in the world, and our place in particularly in the States, and then find progress throughout the adversity, you know. Those are the stories that I think are really compelling to me, because they also tell me something about the present, and they tell me something about, you know, my parents' lives, and gives me a deeper level of respect for the perseverance that they've had in their own lives.
Could I ask you, how in the decades you've been doing this has your concept of greatness changed, if at all?
Yeah, dramatically. It's changed dramatically, because so you know, you can't do family history without becoming a historian. And, you know, you look at the broad, so I mean, I loved history growing up, but the history I got was the history that the Daughters of the American Confederacy created for almost all of America. So it was a false history, you know. And so today we're pretty fortunate, because we've been able to go ahead and we've got new scholars and new scholarship out there that have really sort of blown a lot of that up. And so what's interesting is that now my concept of greatness isn't about trying to be white, frankly. It's about trying to be myself, and also and realizing that I come from someplace and I'm going in someplace, and that there's strength that I can draw on from these various stories. There's tenacity, there's love, courage, bravery, and then there's tough, tragic lessons as well that I can draw on from the family history, and then share those as I go forward and talk about those, with my siblings and my my kid. So the idea of greatness has shifted, because it's not about adopting somebody else's culture. It's finding my own culture, and it's not even about like the great accomplishments. It's understanding that the great accomplishments, the best accomplishments are really oftentimes rather small. They're really rather small, and you see them when you're doing your family history reflected in little shifts in the life and the progress of a family. So as an example,
can you talk? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about the
Absolutely.
small, big accomplishments.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. I'm trying to think of I can think of some small, big ones. Okay, so a couple of small, big ones. On my father's side, in the Bobo line of my family, it's B-O-B-O is the family name. If you ever come across a Bobo, they are my cousin. It is one of the most unique names in America, and almost all Bobos are related because it was a very large family.
We went to school with
Black.
Allison Bobo.
Yeah, we had a couple Bobos in our.
Bobos are a huge family, and Bobos are really well documented because they go way back to I want to say the French Protestants, but I know it's the French something or other. It may not be the Protestants, but they basically go back to France, and they were persecuted for their religion, and they traveled to England, and then they landed in the colonies, and then that family was enormous, and their family's kids was enormous, and they were all slaveholders. So you have this massive family of black and white Bobos interrelated that go back to Gabriel Bobo, the scion of this family, this Frenchman. Anyway, Bessie Bobo. Bessie Bobo is my third great-grandmother, and there was always a persistent myth that she was educated and that she had a college degree. Another big thing for me. I want to know, where did she get her? She was the first in the family to go to college. Now, I had known that Bessie was born in the middle of the 1800s in a small, dusty frontier town in Texas. And I knew the arc of her life, and I knew where she was buried, and I knew a lot about her and her family, but I didn't know where she got her education until I dug through the materials and the research, and I found that she was a janitor, a maid at Southern Methodist University in Texas. And I was like, did she go to Southern Methodist? How did she go? Did she go there? Is that possible during Jim Crow? I mean, it must have been an all-white segregated university. So, I called them up, and they were like, yeah, no records for Bessie Bobo. But I knew that she was clearly putting herself in a location where she could somehow learn or get access to educated people. And soon after that, I found a newspaper article that spoke about a program related to SMU that was through a church that was educating people of color. And I believe that's how she first began to really get educated. Later on, I learned that and I saw this shift from a census document. It was like the 1930 to the 1940 census. I saw that in 1930, she did not have a college education, and she was already, had some grown children. In 1940, she did. And you can see that little hashtag change. And I was like, yes! I was like, I've identified this window in which she got her college education. I still don't know exactly where, but I've got an idea of like the path of how she got there, and I believe that's how it happened. That had a huge impact on her life. I mean, she was a a nurse. She ran a daycare. She also was a teacher, a very, a sort of primary schools type teacher. She was an organizer with Asa Randolph in New York. She was super active in her church and a church leader for many, many years. And so it obviously had a profound impact on her life and the life of her kids, who also went on to get college degrees from places like Wilberforce University and things like that. So it was this moment, this little moment that was a big moment that I saw in the documents that sort of shifted a family perspective. And I think it's had a profound impact on my family, on that line, all of my grandmother, for example, she was college educated very early, on. She basically left school at 18, went straight to college, got her degree, became a teacher. Because of Jim Crow, she wanted to be, I believe, a English teacher, but because of Jim Crow, she had to be a physical education teacher. She did that for a few years and then eventually became the teacher that she wanted to be. And my father then, and his siblings, they also got their college educations. And I think it was an arc of action, a little reverberation and echo that had profound impact on my family's life.
I so much to this idea of doing a big family history and, seeing how choices that wouldn't make it into the history books the way we were taught history are actually the things that kind of brought us to where we are and kind of had these big, huge arc changes in the sort of course of one's family history. And so, diving off from there, I wonder if you were the benevolent dictator of curriculum in the US, what are some things from all of this work that you've done that you might lay out as a different paradigm, if you will, about teaching history writ large, and then, where family history plugs into that?
Yeah. Well, I think, I think that family history, honestly, could be first of all, a family history curriculum, as an elective, would be a phenomenal educational tool that crosses over a number of subjects. And I think it would, one of the reasons why it's so important is, some of the research that I've seen has suggested particularly that for people, if they are actually literally able to talk about their family history and know their family history, it can become a predictor of how successful they'll be in life, similar to like having parents who've gone to college, or to a secondary school or picked up a secondary trade, a trade. And I think that the reason why is it lends itself to this tremendous amount of self-worth, and because of, particularly for African Americans, because of systemic racism, there are these persistent myths that continue to define our culture about who we are, where we come from, what should be important to us, why we're in the trouble we're in now. Like, for example, the massive racial economic wealth gap that exists between African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and white people in this country. It's just massive. The conversation around, for example, reparations. It's just critically important to know your history. And so I think you'll learn practical skills about history and cultural studies. So things you can use almost immediately, in these stories. Then you also get these added benefits of self-worth and inspiration, things you can draw upon in your own life when things are tough. And so I think that the third element of it that's so critical here is the current education system that we have relies heavily on white privilege. And white privilege often is described as, well, first of all, let's go back a second. It relies heavily on systematic racism, where systematic racism works whether you want it to or not, right? So well-meaning whites, well-meaning blacks, we all want it not to be a racist world. But systematic racism doesn't give an F. It's going to keep working. That's its power. The way to dismantle systematic racism is through education and awareness across the board. Now, here's the tricky thing, is white privilege is another tool of systematic racism that prevents white people from ever having to acknowledge or deal with systematic racism. Oh, I've got a black friend. I'm not part of the machine. Oh, it's, not my history. Oh, it's the Daughters of the Confederacy's fault. It's not my fault. It's someone else's life, and I don't have to be a part of it, right? That's where white privilege acts very much against the positive effects that we can see from things like family history. And one way of thinking about this is racism is often taught to white people as it's a disadvantage about black people. I grew up, I had this poor black family down the street from me, and man, they went through a lot. So it's taught as a projection. What it's not taught as is as an advantage to white people. White privilege is an advantage. It's an unearned advantage. Now, nobody wants to get anything for free, but that's what it is. It's an unearned advantage. And so when you have that unearned advantage, you use it. And when you use it, you get this enormous socioeconomic wealth gap that exists between black and white and all the attendant effects of it. Mass incarceration, poverty, hunger, poor health effects, environmental terrorism. You get all these intended, these after effects that literally do things like lower the birth rate of African Americans and Hispanics and people of color, that raise the death rate of black women, that cause hypertension, in African Americans, and it's on and on and on and on and on. So family history, imagine family history being one step in dismantling systemic racism, and I'll give you a great example. So growing up, I think you guys probably all had a history class where at some point your teacher's like, let's talk about the Mayflower. And you open up your books to page 87, and there's basically a bunch of white people coming off the boat. There's some Native Americans, and you go, well, I'm not in this picture, I'm Jewish, we just got here, right? Or, as an African American, you go, yeah, because my people are in the hold of that ship. That's why they're not in that picture. And the deflation, the sadness, the anger, now you're in the fourth grade, the third grade, and the first thing you're taught about the greatness of the country is how you don't fit in there, how your people were less than equal and chattel, and just brought there like cows to do the work. And there's no more research, there's no more history, there's no more story, you're not there, you've been erased, right? That has a huge impact on the way young people perceive their self-worth, and then how they're going to learn, their interest in school and education, showing up, I sat in class and I learned about the Mayflower and I hung my head in shame. Now, very recently I was doing some research and I was looking into actually the Bobo line, and I was looking into the line of an ancestor of mine, Ann Turner. And Ann Turner, I found out, I was searching for her identity. She sort of just popped up in the early 1800s in Texas, and I was like, man, this is going to be tough work to try to figure out who she is. A lot of research, many hours, and I finally figured out who her biological father was. It was a white man named Aaron Turner. And I said, well, I'm not going to just stop here. I want to know all about Aaron Turner. And I went back and I researched Aaron's life. And as I figured out his background and how far it back went, one of the things I immediately came across was, and I think this is something that you will see, is that other people were researching Aaron's line and have done a lot of work on that line. And so as I realized, well, this family history is now my family history. This line is now my line. I'm gonna claim all of it. I'm gonna take all you white people are mine now. You're all part of my story. right? I go back 8, 7, 8, 9 generations, and guess what I hit? I hit the Mayflower. And not only do I hit the Mayflower, I hit 3 or 4 families who came across on the Mayflower on 2 different trips. And including the captain of the Mayflower, John Clark, is my 10th great-grandfather, the pilot of the Mayflower. Now, you know, the story of Ann Turner is a story of trauma, and it's a story of rape. You know, Ann's biological father was a white minister who owned slaves, who brought them from North Carolina and Georgia into Texas. He raped her mother. That's how Ann was born. He enslaved his own daughter, and then eventually she was freed. But that's Aaron Turner, right? Aaron Turner's father, Thomas Turner, yes, he was also a slaveholder. But that's not all he was. He was more than that. And his grandfather and grandmother and so on and so on and so on. So while it's complicated and it's deeply painful to know how I got into that line or how Clark is my 10th great-great-grandfather, it doesn't make it any less true. And if you're African-American, in particular, what you're going to find when you jump into family history and research is that somewhere along the line, you're going to find that the trauma of slavery and the trauma of torture, the trauma of rape, and you're going to find white ancestors. You know, I think it's something like 70% of us have white ancestors. And so those ancestors and their stories, you know, we can choose to make them ours or not, you know. But when my daughter goes to school and they open up the book and they talk about the Mayflowers, you would be damn sure she's going to say, yeah, my 11th great-grandfather was the pilot of the Mayflower, you know.
Can you talk to us a little bit about that choice? You know, now that you know that there's this mix, and specifically who and a little bit more about the how I guess, how do you wrestle with it internally? How do you, how have you processed and how have you chosen which stories you own, or do you have a democratic idea about they're all yours? You know, how does that work?
Yeah, so it's a negotiation, and it's a negotiation not just with me, because this isn't just my history. This is also my family's history. You know, so when I share stuff like this with them, you know, they have different responses to it. You know, some are like, yeah, I just don't want to know about the white ancestors. You know, and I think actually that is an effect of systematic racism. Others are like, I'm going to claim it all. So as another example of how I process and accept or reject or incorporate, you know, the knowledge is, it starts with, for me, an understanding that sometimes the search for this knowledge is going to cause other people pain. You know, to go back to amnesia, that, you know, the amnesia was there to kind of, in some cases, prevent trauma and pain from passing to the next generation. You know, I'll share with you a story because my father has given me permission to talk about this. So my father didn't know his biological father. He knew he had a stepdad he grew up with, wonderful relationship, but he never knew his biological father. His mother had him at, I think, 18 years old. And I always wanted to know who my grandfather was. And I always wanted my father to know. And I asked him a couple years ago, I said, you know, I know this has troubled you, because he would tell me, you know, he would say, I don't know. I know my grandmother is still living, and I don't want to ask her because it will bring back pain to her, will cause her pain. My grandmother's 93, you know, and she's had strokes and she's not fully there, you know, and she suffers from a number of health issues. And it's like, we don't want to cause her any more pain. We don't want to talk about it. I said, well, we don't have to talk about it with her, but I can figure it out if you want me to, Dad. And I started looking, and I said, I can use the tools that I've learned in the last 20 years. I can use DNA. I can use a lot of different things. And that's what I did. My father gave me his DNA test. We had him tested through Ancestry. I tested I asked my grandmother also for her test, and she agreed to give me her test, her DNA for testing, and I got to work. And now, why would I want my grandmother's DNA? So that I could also exclude people as well, right? But sorry, it's a little painful to talk about. But what we were able to do, we were able to find many cousins sort of just pop up. If you've ever used these tools like My Family Search or My Heritage or Ancestry, it's just a wonder, you know, you see boom, 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 boom. You've got matches, you know, and these cousins pop up. And I'm like, who are these people? You know, and I'm like, looking, I'm like, they're related to each other, but I don't know how I'm related to them. And that, you know, and I'm like, that's a line that's a line. There's an ancestor there, a great grandfather, a great grandmother. So through using a lot of research and technique of a number of genealogists that I would love to at some point share with you guys as resources and share with your community. But what I was able to do is identify a line that came out of Chester, Pennsylvania, where my dad was born, and went back to Statesboro, Georgia, about an hour, maybe 40 minutes west of and southwest of Savannah, or west of Savannah. And I'm like, Georgia, like, who are these people? And I'm like, then I look at all these lines and I see, oh, they're from Georgia, they're from Georgia, they're from Georgia, they're from Statesboro, Statesboro, Statesboro. And I'm getting very excited because I'm realizing we've got a small town in southern Georgia with a university, with a lot of history and a lot of writing about it. I'm like, this is something, this is something, this is a big clue. And then I start to see, I'm like, how am I related to this town? Did, you know, maybe my father's ancestor came from this town. So as I dig into the names, in research, I start finding, I found first this incredible researcher out there named Dr. Alvin Jackson, who turns out, of course, he is a cousin of mine, who's done all this family research on a family called the Riggs family. The Riggs family were a number of families that basically created one of the first colored schools after emancipation in that county, Bullitt County. And so I reached out to Jackson. I said, I know we're related. I can see you're on Ancestry and we're cousins, but I don't know my story. I don't know my father's line. And he goes, you know, Chester, Pennsylvania, we had some people from Statesboro leave Statesboro and go to Chester, Pennsylvania. And I'm going, oh, who? Really? And so he starts sharing information with me. We go back and forth. I start looking at like the lines again, and very quickly I identify a Black family in turn of the century, Chester, Pennsylvania, with Statesboro, Bullitt County roots. A whole family. They're descendants of the Riggs family. And from there, I said, Dad, I think this is your line. I think these are our people. And I think, you know, your father is descended from these people. So we are now one step closer. Let's keep going. And he was excited, and we did. And through a lot of difficult work, looking through archival research, census documents, county documents, we were able to identify one of those families. And then through the process of elimination, looking at the timing of my grandmother's life and when she encountered this man, and the timing of the Riggs family that was there in Chester, you know, we came up with 5 logical potential people. The rest I knew was going to probably be luck and DNA. And as it turns out, the search produced evidence of who my biological grandfather is, you know, very strong evidence. One of the wonderful things about everybody getting tested is, of course, you can kind of see DNA family trees. And we found information that pointed directly back to one of those 5 people, and we were therefore able to identify that family. So suddenly we basically had inherited an entire line that I'm 45, that we never knew about, you know, that my father never knew about. And in the quest, you know, he shared some of this with his sisters, and they were like, yeah, you know, this tracks with the little information that we have, you know. And we were able to identify this man. And, fortunately, my grandfather passed away in the 80s. And so my father never got a chance to know him or know any of his people. But what was interesting is he was a shadow in my dad's life. We saw that he lived blocks from my grandmother and her family, that his cousins were blocks away, that they even some of them went to the same church as my father did in his family. Why did, my grandmother keep it a secret all those years? We were afraid of a lot of things: trauma, rape, some kind of crime. Her father was a bit of a gangster. Maybe he scared the kid away. We'll kind of probably never know exactly, but no one wanted to relive that trauma. Nobody wanted her to feel pain. But the truth was still very, very important to go after, because I knew it was causing my father a lot of pain to not know. A lot of pain.
Have you gotten a chance to introduce your dad to some of these folks in the extended Riggs family, and have they kind of welcomed you guys as part of the family?
So yeah, in short, yes. And we're still making connections. I've got a Riggs cousin who's in Georgia. I was just down there and not able to see her because of the quarantine, but I'll see her, soon. And she reached out. So I wrote a story about the Riggs family as I did my own research. So I did my own research into the Riggs family, and I wanted to extend the work that Dr. Alvin Jackson had done. And when that information was published, I shared it. And, because the family is really well known, other people are researching that family. They found it. And they were like, "Hey, cousin, welcome to the family." And they reached out. They have reached out. They usually have a family reunion every year, but because of COVID-19, it's not going to happen this year, but we're going next year. We're going to make it, my father and I, we're going to make a visit to Statesboro once the pandemic is under control. The Willow Hill School and that history is now my history. It's amazing.
That's incredible. Just building off of the DNA tests that it's you and your family have done, in terms of other discoveries and/or first of all, let's just start with other discoveries that you made just from the scientific testing.
Yeah. So interesting, lots of discoveries. One thing I see over and over again is people had kids out of wedlock. It happened all the time, on pretty much every line. I see that because I come across, cousins who are, third, fourth cousins who are, unaware of their how we connect, and we find out how we connect. So I see that. I learned things like I've learned my grandmother had a older sister who died when she was young, but we never knew. She probably didn't know. You learn a lot of interesting things. One of the things that I've learned and used the DNA research for more recently. So one of the persistent myths in African American family research is that the Civil War is the greatest brick wall, and that somehow you can't go past the Civil War to understand where your enslaved or free people of color ancestors lived and how they lived. And that's just all bullshit. That's just completely false. It's completely false. And if you talk to a black genealogist, they will tell you that. If you talk to an ignorant white genealogist, they're going to tell you, "Oh, I feel sorry for you," and how hard it is. But I tell you, it's completely false. And I've been very fortunate to sort of study under several really excellent genealogists of color who have absolutely furthered the field of genealogy in their work. It is a whole crew, and I highly recommend, if anyone's interested in African-American genealogy, that they start with Nika Smith and they look at the Black Progen Live. There are over 100 episodes of a YouTube show. They It features multiple genealogists working all across the South and North on African-American history and genealogy. They will blow your mind with the tools, the resources, the tips, the tricks, the techniques to study your ancestry. And if that's not enough, you can just hire them. I would just hire them. But of course, you know, DNA and DNA genealogy has really broken down a lot of brick walls for African-American people. It's allowed us to look further back. So one of the things about this myth is that you can't find a paper trail about us, which that's bullshit, because as chattel, we show up in wills, probate courts, all these kinds of records that list and inventory objects. And so you can find us in those records. You can find us in manumission and freedom certificates. You can find us in individual county and state censuses if we were free. So for example, in Maryland, in 1832, there was a census of all African Americans who were free. And that has been a boon to me. The census actually disappeared for many years, and it was uncovered and rediscovered like 30 or 50 years ago, about 30 years ago, I think, sitting in the basement of a library. And that, you know, 1830s, with that kind of knowledge, you know, you've got people being born in the late 1700s, you know, you can really, really jump back and make the dot and connect the dots. And here's the cool thing about the further back you go. Oddly enough, the further back you go, the more information you begin to find. Because early America is extremely well documented, very well documented. And if you start to look into the archives of states and counties, you're going to find a treasure trove of information. And simultaneously, we're talking about a much, 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 much smaller population of people in America, much smaller, dramatically smaller. And so you're going to start to find a lot more common ancestors. You know, in your research, you'll realize you're related to friends and genealogists, you know. You're going to find more documentation, things that we wouldn't conceive of being documented at that time, or why they would be documented are casual trips to pick up groceries at a local market in your town, documented. Deciding to leave your county or state, those were things that were documented in newspapers, and other kinds of places like that, where the news was daily life. Very fascinating stuff. And then, so what I have been able to do using DNA is I found that I can place my enslaved ancestors on their plantations and in certain communities based on the other people that are in that community. So it's kind of think of it as a genetic family of friends and neighbors that all exist together at the same time. And you can go back and you can, by using the fan club method or the friends and neighbors method, you can identify how communities live together and move together from different places. And then because of the trauma of rape, which I mentioned earlier, and slavery and torture, you know, I found white ancestry, and I've been able to place Black ancestors in proximity to those white ancestors on the plantation, right? And so by placing them in proximity, I then get strong guidance to then completely examine the life of that white ancestor. And back then they kept farm books. The farm books tracked everything that happened on the farm. Not all farm books, you know, obviously have survived. You have to have some luck, but there are plenty of documents that can be uncovered. And then of course, you know, the bills of sale, you know, those exist for enslaved people. And then if you were a free person of color and you were involved in any kind of trade, any kind of business, it was documented. So I look back to the Maryland Eastern Shore in Queen Anne's County, where I have a long line of free people of color. I have deeds from the 1840s between them and their neighbors for land, you know, 20 years before the Civil War. And also other documents like freedom certificates that expose familial relationships. And familial relationships is always something that's a little tricky and hard to identify you see a list and sometimes you're like, how are these people related? Because it's just first names. Well, there was a protocol to how these names were listed out by age, by seniority, sometimes by value. And you can decipher those things with a little bit of work. But what's been compelling for me and a really powerful tool is the genetic genealogy, because it's allowed me to identify my white ancestors. And, it's not because I'm chasing whiteness. It's more like I'm trying to say my, fourth, fifth, or Black great-great-grandmother, great-great-grandfather, and her community were here on this plantation at a specific time, and now I can figure out, like, what was their whole life like? What did they do? How long were they enslaved? How many generations were there? Did they have a relationship with their enslaver in some way? And I found a really compelling story that I wrote recently on my blog a few months ago about the Riggs family. Basically, what I realized is my fourth great-grandmother, Harriet Riggs, was the biological daughter of her enslaver, Thomas Neville. And she was a dower slave. So when Thomas Neville's white daughter, Dicey, married James Donaldson in Statesboro, she was given to Dicey, and her kids were given to Dicey because the increase of the slavery goes with the mother. And when Donaldson died, she married again, and Harriet continued to stay with that family, obviously because she was enslaved. It wasn't her choice. And then it happened again 3 times, actually 4 times, I believe. Dicey's husbands died. And so she became—
And this is her half sister.
And this is her half sister. That's another way of putting it. And, I've looked at the Neville family, and there's no way you're not going to you look at this family and not think that they're a Neville family. So, every day you're like, hey, half Black sister, go get me, my clothes, or fetch my milk, or, or I'll beat you, every day of her life. That was the reality back then. And one interesting thing that happened was during those many marriages and deaths, Dicey ran into trouble, and she basically was going to sell Harriet and her family. Her half-brother and Dicey's brother purchased Harriet, but then Harriet was allowed to stay with Dicey. And so he bailed his sister out by purchasing his sister, not just his sister, but also his nephews and niece, and then kept them together. It's remarkable. I don't mean it in a good way. We ask ourselves how the tragedies of the Holocaust and Native American genocide and George Floyd, how that shit can take place. There is the capacity for great evil in us. And obviously there is the capacity for great good. And I think the family history work, it allows us to see both sides.
I think you speak truth. I'm kind of speechless to hear some of these stories, and also the breadth and depth of what you've been able to uncover across these many years of work.
I can share a few tips that I think were really important in the journey. I wanted to make sure that I guess folks walked away and realized that it's not that this work, which is really amazing, doesn't come without a lot of legwork, and and at a cost. And basically, I've spent many late nights deep in right now the digital archives of, South Carolina and Georgia and Maryland, looking through just dozens and dozens and hundreds and sometimes thousands of pages of records. What's really interesting is that in the last 10 years, many records have become indexed, and searching first and foremost for indexes. That is my number one tip. It will save you so much pain. In any catalog, digital or otherwise, start with the index and use the fan method. Don't just look up the names of your ancestors. Look up the names of the people who, if you know any people in the community of your ancestors, also in the index, because these folks all did business together. They traded together. Their children intermarried. And look for the community, not just the individual, to uncover what the true life was like of your ancestor. And then I would say also go to the home place. At some point, you've got to leave ancestry.com and familysearch.org, and you've got to get in a car and you've got to drive and you got to go. It will profoundly change the way you look at your research. On a recent trip down to see my in-laws in Atlanta, I stopped through Greenville. I have a huge family on my mother's side, the Mays family that come from Greenville. And I knew that we were instrumental in starting some churches there. I knew that the Mays family was still, quite large there. And I realized that the church that I had probably passed literally the plantation in the church that my mother's family worked on and created a dozen times in my drives down to Georgia, and never realized how close it was to the highway on the way down. So I stopped in Greenville and I went to the church, and it was closed. There was nobody there, and I was so frustrated and annoyed because I was like, this is so rare for me to be here. But I took a picture of the church's cornerstone, I guess. And it had my family's name, Mays is on there, the Walkers on there. But then I went around back. I'm like, okay, I'm going to see if there's a cemetery. And it was a trailer park. And my heart was broken. And I was like, no, how can there be a trailer park here? There should be a cemetery here. I looked at the map. There's no cemetery. What happened, And I just felt this tremendous sense of loss. So I reached out to another cousin when I was in Georgia, and I was like, man, I tried to stop in Greenville and see the cemetery, and I think it's gone. He said, no, it ain't gone. I said, I went behind the church. There's a trailer park there. It's gone. He's like, no, you got to go across the tracks. I'm like, what? I open up Google Maps and I'm looking at the picture. I'm like, oh my God, there's a cemetery. It's on the other side of the tracks behind the trailer park. So on the way back home to Maryland, I stopped with my daughter and my wife, and I started walking through this cemetery, and I just, stone after stone, I'm like, I know this family. I know this surname. There's my, third cousin. There's my third great grandfather. And just standing there in the cemetery, looking at the stones, I felt like I was connecting to my ancestors. And, what I found was, I don't have pictures of all of them, but I have pictures of every gravestone. I know where they are. I think that's really important. Another interesting thing is, obviously you can learn a lot from a gravestone, and you can learn a lot by getting out there. I went on a trip to the Queen Anne's County last year, and during that trip, I had a wonderful local historian and librarian take me in her car, Lucille Kurtz, or Kunst, I think. No, Kurtz. Lucille Kurtz took me all around Queen Anne County. We went into graveyards. We went to some farms that were previously plantations that my family had been enslaved on. We went to communities of free, areas that were clearly communities of free color. We came across one graveyard, and I came across a stone that had the name of my third great grandfather on it, Asbury Johnson, but the information just didn't add up. I was like, this isn't right. He didn't live this long, and who is this person who was supposed to be his wife? And later on, I found out it was Asbury Johnson's nephew, his gravestone. It was his daughter's son, you know, and yeah, it just put it all into perspective for me, you know.
Joel, there's a lot of anxiety in my own family now that we sort of know what the place names of where my people hail from, that, you know, that the history in each of those unique places is so tragic for, you know, the community that we came from, that there's this really strong attitude of like, why would you want to go back there? You know, like, and that played out across many generations. And to some degree, as part of that amnesia I was telling you about, what would you say to me or my family about, like, because I'm imagining that in some cases, you know, the place that you know, you're saying to go to these places, but those are also places with a history of trauma. What
Yeah.
do you think is the plus minus around that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a tough one because everyone's traumas are different, you know. I gotta say this. I mean, you know, we get opportunities sometimes to stop a cycle of trauma, and I think that that's what I was working on with my father, and how lucky are we today to be able to do that? How lucky are we? I mean, we have, you know, some disposable income. We've got an American passport, maps, Google Maps. How lucky are we to be able to exercise our own will against, you know, that trauma, to fight back against it and try to end that cycle. I think we owe it to our ancestors. I think they call to us. I think they call to us to keep working on their lives in a way. They don't want us to be in pain.
Pete, are you able to, can we hear you?
Yeah, I want to apologize for accidentally muting myself earlier, but it wouldn't have made any difference because, like you said, Adam, I really honestly feel speechless hearing you talk, Joel, and share the work that you've done and with us and the lessons you've gleaned from it. And I'm so impressed with, you know, the level of detail that you've been able to uncover through, you know, on hours and hours and of painstaking work. I really don't feel like I'm should say anything after what you just said. It was so powerful and so beautiful. I don't want to follow it because I really like your idea of letting our ancestors calling out to us to keep working on their lives. I'll just repeat that if I didn't screw it up too badly, because
That's it.
That's a very powerful idea.
Yeah.
And to me, you know, your desire that these all of what you learn doesn't get lost for your child or for the next generation. And so everything that you said speaks to the power and the importance of preservation, of memory, of documents, of a sense of oneself, where one comes from.
Mhm.
So I just said I didn't want to say anything more than what you said, but I did anyway.
I think you. I mean, I think you added to it in a brilliant way, Pete. Because so if we don't preserve it, we lose it. There's a guy I credited for in the story of Harriet Riggs, who in my blog post, David Beasley. David Beasley was an ordinary or a lawyer in the 1800s during the Civil War in Statesboro, Bullitt County in Georgia. During Sherman's famous March to the Sea, as you guys well know, because you're down there in Georgia, many courthouses were burned, many city halls were burned, and some large plantations were burning when it happened. A lot of people's history is lost. It wasn't just the white people's history who's lost. It was also the black people, because we were in those records. Mm-hmm. David Beasley knew that Sherman was marching from town to town, burning records. He grabbed all of the records from the Bullitt County Courthouse, which burned down over a series of years, like 3 times. And he took it and he put it in his barn and hid it. Amazing. I would not have Harriet's story. I would not have one of the most important documents I've ever found in my research if this lawyer hadn't preserved the history. And that document was a notice of sale. It was the notice of sale when Dicey Neville was selling Harriet Riggs and her family. It was in that batch of documents. And I think in the end, Sherman decided not to actually burn the courthouse. I believe that's what I learned. But he sure as hell could have. I think it was because some of the research that I've seen suggested that Sherman and his people passed by, but not close enough to the town, and the town was actually really run down and impoverished, and he didn't want to cause any more misery. So.
Last week, Joel, we spoke with an Orthodox Jewish woman who shared this Yiddish quote that had the word tuchus in it, and it was essentially some variation of, you got to put your tuchus on the table, which means you got to put your butt on the table, which is an idiom for her that means at a certain point there's an action step, that nothing means anything unless there's an action step that you take from it. And so I was thinking that one of the ways I wanted to sort of end these conversations is a chance for each of us to reflect in some way, if anything, on an action step that kind of emerged, even as just a larval idea from the conversation today. I will begin. Everything you said has been so deeply thought and powerful. I want to, any slice of it, I think, could be shared and we can derive a lot of meaning from it. In one thing I really spoke to me was your vision of how structural racism impacts the way we learn history. And so I guess for me, an action step today is thinking about ways in which I can be an advocate for changing just at the curricular level, even if it's as simple as I see a curriculum of one of my kids come through that I can see it has embedded structural racism and try and call it out. And I think that history as a subject, the kind of work that you've done opens us up to so many different paradigms of how to see individuals and how to see historical movements. And I'd like to think about ways, again, this is my took us on the table.
Yeah,
I'd like to think about ways for advocacy to move the needle on how we think about history. Since I just sprung this idea on you, let's go to Pete and see if
yeah.
you have any took us on the table ideas.
Well, that was one of my big ones too. And I have a couple thoughts about that, but I also, your story of David Beasley, I feel like there's a play to be written in there about that piece of paper.
Yeah.
And its story. That's just an incredible, talk about like, a kind of a seemingly small action with huge consequences that no one, surely David Beasley, never anticipated and maybe never intended. But I love this. I'm thinking like Adam probably about my own education in school and the stupid little field trips we took to Joel Chandler Harris's house in West Atlanta, and and what all of that communicated. But the idea, I love this idea of an elective course on family history. And what would it look like if we reimagined history curricula, whoever the we is? I mean, we homeschool our children, so I guess, but I'm thinking about this and how I could do this for my own kids. And they're already surrounded by a little of this, but not near to the level of detail you've executed it. But what would a curriculum of historical knowledge look like that prioritized this personal, the personal family history and the road trip part of it, which is another thing I'm a huge advocate of. And I mean, the experience of going there and being on site for yourself cannot be communicated in any other way. It can't be translated just in writing or really photography or anything like that. So when you talk about, on your blog, you talk about how this type of genealogical research leads to a broader understanding. I'm going to quote you: a broader understanding of history in the world, in particular, American history and our place in it. And I have had these thoughts as you've been speaking, like what would America look like after a generation or two of people who grew up with that kind of relationship to American history, that sort of personal connection to it, and who had, how different would America be as a place and as a culture if for the next 30 years our curricula for history looked like something like what you've described and you've done.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a pretty big action step, but
it is, but it's not. It's something that's being thought of right now. I mean, I know Dr. Gates, Henry Louis Gates, is working on just such a thing, and he's already working with elementary school kids in some family history camps. And it's something that it's a bigger vision that has involved a lot of folks already. So it could be connecting with it, and bringing it to Atlanta. It could be figuring out how to help. I think that would be remarkable, and I think I love the idea of what a vision of that looks like in 100 years or in 2 or 3 generations. It's going to be really amazing because this country continues to get so diverse. It's going to be, and there's so many untold stories. I think it could be incredible. So one thing you said, Pete, about the idea like Beasley's story could be a play, I forgot to mention at the top of this, and I think this is putting my tuchus on the table. One of the reasons why I really got interested in family history, I was researching the possibility of writing a play. I wanted to write a play about John Brown. And I spent 3 years reading everything I could find about Brown, and I learned about his the people he died with, his co-conspirators, and several of them were former slaves, some free people of color, who were part of his sort of team, as it were, when they raided Harper's Ferry. And I went and visited Harper's Ferry, and I learned about all these incredible people. One of them, Shields Green, which actually there's a film that's just been made about Shields Green, had a compelling story. He was enslaved, and he was the son of an African prince. And so his nickname was Prince, or he was, during that time. And then Dangerfield Lewis, one of the documents they have from that raid was Dangerfield's letter to his wife, before the raid, and he died during the raid, tragically. But I was researching John Brown's story, and as I was reading it, and I've got a few scripts, about John Brown. I was like, is this a screenplay? Is this a play? I've got a few starter scripts, and it just nothing clicked. I was like, man, this is not working. And then finally, I was like, it's not working because it's not my story. It's not my story. Mm-hmm. And that's when I started digging into the family history research. I said, I'm going to find a story in my own damn life and tell it. I'm fascinated by this period, fascinated by the events around the beginning that led up to the Civil War and Reconstruction. That is just overwhelmingly fascinated by that period. So, so I guess putting myself I took us on the table, I have found a story that I want to turn into a play. I found a story on a family line, on my mother's family line. It's the story of an enslaved family that was emancipated. They were also in the Staunton, Virginia area, but it wasn't Philander Ransom's family. It was the family of Philander's son's wife. So my third great-grandmother's family. Their last name was the Blacks. They were Black families. And they were enslaved by a man there, John Black. And John Black, he started getting these epileptic seizures, and he knew he was going to die. And he was in his 30s, I think, when it happened. And he wrote his will, or rather his sister came over to his house, and they wrote the will together, and they freed all of his slaves, including my fourth great-grandmother and her family, and then my third great-grandmother. And that will was contested by John Black's family. It was a lot of wealth that he was suddenly throwing out the door, and they wanted that wealth. They wanted those bodies. They wanted that labor for themselves. And that's usually what happened back then. So all the court records are in the Virginia Chancery records online, and I have them all. And it was during the Works Progress administration, they went in and they transcribed all those records. So I actually have them in a readable format. And I'm like, this is a play. And I'm like sharing it with the family. I'm like, I want to write this story. This is the story. This is an incredible story. It's going to open up with John Black on his deathbed, talking to his sister, who was a witness in the court case, and my family surrounding him, but silent. Mm. So putting my tips on the line, I'm going to write that play.
I know a theater company that might be able to support you in this. On that note, I can't express how grateful we are to you for your time. This has just been
likewise
wonderful, really.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you, and we will continue. And we're getting a chance to see some of our other people who have checked in. But really, thanks so much, and we'll have this up on Facebook in a slightly, with an intro and an outro pretty soon. So
wonderful.
Really,
thank you so much, Joel.
Thank you, and let's keep the conversation going.
Definitely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye.